Good afternoon. Welcome. It gives me great pleasure to actually introduce to you the topic, which is as was told to me a few minutes back, is a very fresh topic, and perhaps no one has really worked on it. So definitely, all of us are new to this area, and that really makes it not just exciting, but it's also just makes it fairly how do I put it, inclusive. And and this is an area where I feel it's not just economists, but planners, urban transport people, trade. I think we can talk about just a whole range of spaces which are impacting and being going to be impacted by this amazing change that is happening. So welcome again to CSEP. As some of you know, CSEP is a multidisciplinary think tank. It is has about 100 plus scholars working in 10 different verticals, ranging from urban issues to trade to mining, modeling, macroeconomics, foreign policy, energy issues. I might have missed a couple. Yeah, health and education. And we take great pride in the fact that we are multidisciplinary, and therefore it gives me that much more pleasure to be here in this seminar, where we have a different perspective coming together on a topic which is increasingly becoming relevant. And again, let me bring in CSEP here. CSEP is one of the few organizations which is compulsorily hybrid. That means you cannot come to work for more than 2 days a week. So
you can come, you just can't work.
we probably send you back. Yeah. So indeed, and it has many different applications. I'm really interested in urban issues, and increasingly more so given the mess that cities in India are. And I'm just trying to talk a little bit about some of those factors. I mean, as we grow more and more comfortable with this whole concept, not only will the need for infrastructure change, it may reduce, but it will definitely change. Our need for energy will change. Our how we handle gender in urban spaces change. How safety and security issues happen within cities, which are really important for Indian cities, as we all know, that will change. And they will change in ways which we can't even predict. So I think it's incredibly important that for all of us to try to at least put on the thinking hat and think about how do we look at this animal and where will this animal take us. So with that, let me welcome Professor Davis. And Professor Davis is the Ragnar Nurkse Professor of Economics and International Affairs at Columbia University. He earned his undergraduate degree in social and ethical philosophy from the University of California, Berkeley, and his PhD in economics from Columbia. Before joining Columbia, he was a faculty member at Harvard from 92 to 99. Professor Davis has served as a chairperson of Columbia's Department of Economics and has been on various editorial boards. He is also the past president of the Urban Economics Association. His research spans multiple areas within spatial economics, international trade, economic geography, regional economics, and urban economics. His work has explored trade theory testing, the role of market scale in international trade and inequality, the distribution of skills across cities of different sizes, and the segregation of consumption by race and ethnicity within cities. Thank you and welcome. I'll just hold on. I'll just take this opportunity to also introduce Harsha Vardhana Singh, who's the chairperson of IKDHVAJ Advisors, a boutique consulting firm on trade policy, industrial policy, and regulatory policy. He has worked at the GATT WTO for 20 years, including as the Deputy Director General for 8 years. From mid-97 to September 2004 to 2005, he was the economic advisor and then secretary of the TRAI. And since end of 2013, he has worked with think tanks, including at what we now call CSEP, think tanks in India, US, Switzerland, Canada, and taught at universities in the US and China. He has also been a member and chairperson of the high-level expert groups in India and abroad on international trade, industrial policy, and competition policy. Thank you. Welcome, Harsh. And Shahana is Chattaraj, is Director of Research at the World Resources Institute for Equitable Development. Her research interests lie at the intersection of cities, urbanization, and development, with a focus on comparative urban research, urban political economy, governance and planning, migration, the informal economy and the informalization of work. Shahana has taught and held fellowships at Oxford, the University of Pennsylvania, and the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. She holds a PhD in Public Affairs from Princeton University, a master's degree in International Development from MIT, and an undergrad degree in architecture. Wow, now that is multidisciplinary. Prior to her PhD, he worked at the United Nations Population Fund and the World Bank, as well as Community Development Organization in Delhi. Welcome. So with that, may I request Professor Davis for you to give your talk. You can be there or here, whatever you're comfortable.
I can stay here.
However,
please.
Go in. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Well, actually, let me stand up. First, thank you for the warm welcome, and thank you, for participating in this. Thanks to Laveesh and Shahana. As I mentioned when we were introducing ourselves, Laveesh managed to make sure that at least somebody on the panel knew much more about every aspect of the problem than I did. So I'm actually very grateful for that. I come here not to pontificate, but to learn. And so starting with that, let me just say, so it's called Work from Home, Work from Anywhere, Urban and Global Economic Development. And let me explain to you why I chose this title. I couldn't find a more ponderous and pompous one, so I tried. But there were some big questions that I was trying to think about. So, and the big question, I'll tell you what the origins of this was. When will wages depend only on who you are, that is your capabilities, and not where you are? And we can think about that there may be differences in opportunities, become educated, and so on. But I was traveling in Mexico, and there are lots of extremely capable people there, and they get paid way less than if they were in the United States, and basically same capabilities. And when you go around the world, you encounter people, you just go, this person is super impressive. But you know that those wage differences persist. And as an economist who's thinking about law of one price and so on, you wonder, how is it possible for those to persist? And so that's the first thing that I want to be thinking about through various things. So my background is in international economics, and so there are myriad forms of globalization that should sort of help to arbitrage these differences. And there's been both a lot of theoretical development and also obviously a lot of things happened on the ground. We've had time to see how these various forms of integration do or don't erase those differences. And so I just want to take, sort of the temperature. What have we learned? What is the big picture thing? And then the third is to try and think about regional and urban economics. That's the area that I've been moving increasingly into. And think about it with the same kind of intellectual process. And think of it as a place that's a laboratory for learning about, both about what's happening there, but it has a specific relation to international exchange and the forms of international integration, and to think about the future of this process, and also the limits in terms of how the things, and this is where working from home, working from anywhere is going to come into the story. So you've probably seen these people before. On the left is Paul Samuelson, who was the teacher for Jagdish Bhagwati, who I'm sure you all know. Jagdish was both my teacher and also Prachi Mishra's teacher. And so they're going to come up in the path of this discussion. And I'm going to call it theory and strategy for equality. So let's sort of start out with the switches. So for those who've had any contact with international economics, you're very aware of the factor price equalization theorem. I'm not going to prove it for you today, but you can get a list of conditions under which trade alone is going to be sufficient to yield factor prices that are the same everywhere. And, so it has to do with technologies, prices, perfect competition, endowments, and some more technical things I'm not going to go into. Well, as an empirical proposition, you just have to laugh. From the very moment that it was launched, that the theorem was stated, everyone agreed that it's absolutely counterfactual. We lived in a world of vast inequalities, and I'll add four of the same types, which was sort of the observation US and Mexico that motivated me trying to think about this path of things. How does this sustain itself? But, so that's going to be one set of questions. And I want to say that in spite of the fact that it's absolutely crazy in terms of thinking about the data, it's nonetheless enormously fruitful starting point. Why? Because it leads you to focus on what are the things that lead the theorem to fail and begin to think about how you would quantify those. Okay, and so, there's a path. I was involved in some of these things, think about factor content of trade. Are there differences in TFP, that is productivity, or factor quality that might help to explain these things? There's lots of models that try and think about the trade costs that may cause divergences and the trade barriers that may, and so there's been a quantification exercise. But there's also another approach to thinking about this. And what is that alternative agenda? So the alternative agenda, I call Jagdish a strategist for FPE via global integration. I'm not sure if he quite thought of it that way, although he certainly thought that it would lead to greater equality, which is basically to look insofar as one of the things that can either eradicate these differences or provide a path, to close them. So trade, of course, is most distinguished public advocate of the WTO. Migration is scholar and advocate. Long-term investment, we want to talk about short-term, and more. So he contributed a lot of these things. But what was it ultimately about? It was taking all of the reasons that factor price equalization, paying the same amount for people of a similar quality wherever they are, to try and figure out ways to smash those barriers. And so, I think that if you had to give a simple characterization of his life's work, that was it. Okay. So, he wrote, basically his whole career is addressed to that question. I'll just mention In Defense of Globalization as one of these. And one can think, we talk about gains from trade, and we have to be a little bit more precise. Again, Jagdish is a scientist and an advocate based on that understanding. But if you're a scientist, then guess what? You have to deal with the data. And so we want to think about where have we gotten to? And here it's also important to recognize that from the theory side, and he was a master of theory, you have quite different concept of what gains are and which ones of them are more or less robust. So if we talk about aggregate world gains from these various forms of integration, you can find exotic examples in which that fails, okay? But for the most part, that's going to be a really robust proposition that there are aggregate gains from integration. There's a step forward from that, which is mutual gains, okay? And here, we could think about it as two, but you could think about it as many. Basically, in some sense, it acts like a participation constraint if we're thinking about a formal agreement between people. But of course, it's also true, and I would direct you, for example, in the afterward, when he did the last edition of In Defense of Globalization, he actually took up a paper that Paul Samuelson had written and very gently disputed some of the things. What he didn't dispute was the theory. And the theory basically is about international technology transfer and about when that is in a source of mutual gain versus gains for one but not for the other. And the short version of this is that in the simple context that Samuelson was talking about, if you have two countries and one of the countries has an advantage in their exportable good, the other country improves its productivity in the first country's exportable good, that's typically not going to be good for it. Now, Jagdish, of course, had a story about why that's not the thing that should most concern us and so on. But the point is that mutual gains are not assured. And, that again, we're pushing from something that's almost surely true, aggregate gains, to something that's a little less certain. And I'll mention just as another example. And here it's, if you already have free trade between countries, international migration that is motivated by technological differences always lowers the real welfare of the country receiving the immigration. Okay, basically just work with a little Ricardian model where one has sufficient advantage that they end up with the higher wage. That's actually, it's something, it doesn't enter the conversation, but basically it just wipes out all of your gains from trade. It returns you to autarky. And so, that's, again, this is not saying this is well, I'll leave that to the side how probable that is as a real thing. I think that it's been appreciated by the international, how would you say it, the international economics community, but it's there. And then the final one is about, so again, we've talked about aggregate gains, very robust. Mutual gains, well, for lots of things, probably near universal gains. Why does near universal gains? If you read in Defense of Globalization, he doesn't at all make the case as a theoretical proposition that everyone gains. Even since Stolper-Samuelson, we've known that there are losers from trade. But the whole point of Stolper-Samuelson and that genre of trade theory was that, well, yeah, but the winners can compensate the losers. And then you pause for a moment and then you ask, but do they? Okay. And so obviously, Jagdish also is somebody who spent a lot of time thinking about political economy. And you can think about what's this, going to mean? Should one expect in general that if there are losers, that they are in fact going to compensate them? And if not, if in some sense they can use some of those gains to try and sustain a regime in which they don't have to compensate the losers, then you start worrying about whether this is actually going to be politically sustainable. Okay. So let's do a scorecard. So Jagdish is writing on the basis, he's writing in the early 2000s on the basis of the best available evidence at the time. And we can say, well, we have another 20 years of data. How's it going? And I think, so when I think about India and China, and the one true thing that I will say today is I am not an expert on this. But my impression is that the single most important thing that's happened in my lifetime in terms of world welfare is the problems in India and China. That's again, not that other things don't matter, but this is just overwhelming what the changes have been. And I think that engagement with the global economy is a central element of this. Now, does this eliminate concerns about distributional questions? Are there any distributional questions still wandering around? Of course there are. But it's a lot easier to think about how to handle these when you're having these spectacular growth. Okay? And but then you go, okay, well, and so that's about India and China. What about on the flip side? And of course, this is not the sum of the world, but we could ask about the advanced countries. I would say that Jagdish was an optimist about this, that he felt that again, in defense of globalization, had lots of different things that he was looking at, but one of them was what will be the impact on workers in the advanced economies. And again, I think that's a much harder case. And the most persuasive evidence has come since Jagdish's book. Okay, I'm going to summarize, 20 years of research by vast numbers of people with one slide. So this is the slide. So this is for France, but you could do it for the U.S., the U.K., for many sort of advanced countries. Basically, all this shows is it lines up. So this is France, 1994 to 2015. On the x-axis, I've lined up what the average wage in an industry was in 1994. And then on the vertical axis is the percentage job growth that happened in that occupation. Okay. And basically, labor market polarization says that, and this will be due to globalization, but it'll also be due to technical change. So there's no effort here to separate the interact. But what is happening for sure, and this is in terms of the count of jobs, is that the middle is getting crushed. Okay, there's growth at the bottom end, there's growth at the top end, and especially in some occupations, there's declines in the middle. So in some sense, and at the bottom end, those are a lot of non-traded occupations. How would you say it? And also non-routine, meaning that at least up to now, they've been harder to have technology replace them. But that's basically the picture. And if you do the wage version of this, it looks pretty similar, that the wages in the middle are getting crushed. And so, what are the consequences? What are going to be the political economy? We could think, okay, this is 1994 to 2015. Let's just pick a couple of countries, one in North America, one in Europe. How about these? Okay. And I think that Obama was pretty pro-trade. Germany much more so throughout, but Barack, I think, was not wildly in favor of immigration, but these things were all relative. Merkel, of course, was more pro-immigration than a lot of things recently, and we switch, and we go, okay, well, Merz, of course, just coming in the last few days, but Trump, of course, is the headline thing is stop immigration and indeed expel potentially millions of people. Okay, we'll see how that goes, but at least that form of international integration is something that clearly is central to him. He's also intervening tremendously. And we don't know everything that's coming. There's so much change happening at the moment in terms of open markets. And to return, I'm sure I haven't talked to Jagdish for some months, but I'm sure that the return to bilateralism that the U.S. is paving the way on would tremendously upset him. But again, look at that and look at that. And I think that you'll learn, that these two things are probably pretty strongly connected. In terms of the politics, if you have the middle class jobs there getting crushed and the wages going down. Now, nothing about the aggregate gains is disputed here. Probably you could take those gains and redistribute and make people happy enough, but obviously it's not happening, okay, or not happening adequately so that again, this is, so there's the political equilibrium. So we could ask whether global economic integration, we're in for stormy times. Is the WTO going to be in mothballs? Obviously an aggressive bilateral trade posture, above all by the US. Resistance to immigration. So, I mentioned Trump. Merz obviously is headed that direction. The rise of the Alternative for Deutschland is a piece of that. The rise in France is, of the right, anti-immigration right is a big piece of that. And so, this turned me to the question, are there new forms of global economic integration to explore? So, and this thought was, what can we learn about this from regional and urban economics? So I talked about, we started out by talking about Samuelson and factor price equalization. And so it's at least an interesting starting point to think, is there factor price equalization inside of a country? And I think that where you get to is a couple of things. So one is a lot of the things that would fail and help to explain the failure of FPE across countries. Obviously, within countries, almost all of those things, or at least many of those things, disappear. So I do understand that there used to be taxes on trade within India between different states. I also understand that disappeared at a certain point. That was in the Constitution that can't exist in the U.S. Obviously, once you have intranational factor mobility, you are going to erase sort of the fact that you're trapped in national borders. What do you end up with? Well, okay, I will get there. I promise. Okay, so new forms of remote work are becoming more common, and how will they reshape the problem? So I'm going to skip all that. I mentioned some of it. Wages aren't equalized because locations are heterogeneous inside of a country. It gives rise to different land prices. Land prices, you need compensation. There may be reasons that there are different locations with different TFP. That's going to mean that even when you have arbitrage of utility, you won't necessarily have factor price equalization in nominal terms. So this is the work from home shock. So I'm looking at US data, and on the left-hand side shows the fraction of hours that are worked from home starting since 1965. And it was on this slow crawl up from pretty close to zero to about 7%, and then COVID hit. So this is taken from Barrero, Bloom, and Davis. It goes up to 61. On the right-hand side, what you see is that it seems to be converging to about 28%. This is a big once and for all change in learning about what it means to work from home, definition of what kinds of technologies we have available to us, and so on. And the question becomes, what implications does this have before this? I'll just mention that this is more common among more skilled people. Some of the work from anywhere stuff tended to be call centers and things like that that differ. But this is from Dingle and Neiman. It basically has share of the job that can be done at home and the initial the median hourly wage. It basically says high wage jobs are the ones that can the task entirely be done from home. But there's a technological characterization. It's not a market characterization. So there is evidence. So in the US, it's more large cities than small that have strong working from home. It's skill biased, so that the skilled are more likely to work from home. That's sort of the composition issue. They're more sort of hands-on things that use relatively unskilled. But there is this question then, we're in this vast experiment of working from home, when does work from home become something that can become fully remote? And you know that there are a lot of people that are working from home, and they're wondering, why do I have to pay San Francisco real estate prices to go into the office one day a week? Why can't I just, work from somewhere that's pretty and less expensive and so on like that? That is, they're testing the limits of being able to work from anywhere. Okay. And we say, be careful what you wish for the reason that if you really could do these jobs working from anywhere, anywhere includes places where the capabilities of people are extremely high and the wages of people are extremely low in relative terms. And the question is, I talked about how in the other forms of globalization, it took us a couple of decades to be able to get a good sense. It didn't all happen the moment that that these new forms of global integration were put in place. And it's really a question, is work from anywhere going to be something that really is a big thing? And if it is, even within a country, how long can it be captured within the borders? Will that be, if we're limiting migration, if we're throwing up at least some barriers to exchange, we'll leave aside multinationals, but is this going to be an important new dimension? Now, we know that it already is in some ways, right? So there are call centers, there's offshoring that does take advantage and arbitrage some of these things. But again, we're in a new world, I think, post-COVID shock, where even within the US, there's this tremendous exploration. And again, as I mentioned, 37% of the US workforce could work essentially fully remote. Okay. And that's actually pretty shocking. Now, that's not what's actually happening in the data. That's, again, the hypothetical. And so I've mentioned many of these things. There are things that limit it. There are frictions. Can you match up with good workers? Can you assess the quality of the workers? There are ways that people are trying to do this with Upwork, with some of the offshoring to local firms, et cetera, et cetera. But it remains a challenge. So, and this is the last set of topics. What does this portend for the future? Okay, semi-founded predictions, surely. And I'll just say, one is adjustment takes time. So Jagdish is writing in the early period of this, thinking about these other forms of globalization, what the distributional consequences are, what the political equilibrium is. But we don't know the answer yet to working from anywhere. Is that going to be a thing? Or again, one of the things why didn't people spread out more evenly, even within a country? Okay. And it seems that maybe it was this thing about it's different, talking to Laveesh when I'm here than if we were trying to do it on Zoom. That, Zoom is lovely if you already know the person, you're deeply in conversations, but maybe it's hard to keep that spark. And I don't know, but we're in the early stages. Some of the work from anywhere has already moved, again, call centers, et cetera. How much of the higher end labor is possible to move? The managers, at least for the moment, tend to be sticking close to home. But we are in this vast experiment accelerated by the pandemic. So if I had to go out on a limb, I'm going to conjecture that in some sense, and I'll just go back to one picture. Okay, this is the picture that I have in mind. Again, what happened is that it was a middle tier of ones that got affected. What I suspect is that it's going to be one step up. It'll continue to be, these are going to still be affected, but that it's also going to be one step up from this, because the wage differences between these extremely capable people in the US or France or wherever, just if working from anywhere becomes a thing, that's where a lot of pressure has to be. there's something called artificial intelligence. So I'm happy to, I think that it's potentially important in this discussion, but I think that we're really early in learning about it. And so I will leave it to people who are braver than I to try and figure out how that fits in. So thank you.
Harsha, may I now request you to?
Thank you. Can you hear me? And thank you very much for a stimulating lecture. It covered a huge canvas of ideas. So I'll try and focus on the last few thoughts which you shared with us. I won't comment on the WTO because I'll just answer that question. It's not going to be in mothballs.
Okay.
It'll be a different WTO. So okay, we can go into that on a separate occasion if you wish. So I just feel that this trend of work from home got accelerated during COVID, and it'll stabilize and go more and more, both in terms of work from home or work being transferred to a different place. Why am I saying this? Because technology, especially M2M communication, machine-to-machine communication, and 3D printing will change the whole situation of trade and where the product is produced. You might actually produce the idea somewhere else, and through machine-to-machine communication, you can give it to another place, and then M2M to 3D printing. So you'll lose any idea over time of what is the origin of a product. So this whole thing of trade is based on this country produces X and exports Y, that to another country. It produces Y, export to different countries. I think that is going to be blurred over time. The implication of that, so I'm more comfortable with trade rather than urban. And thankfully for my thoughts, you did not go too much into the urban bit. So basically, where does origin become important? One is in looking at what is international trade. And second is to determine preferential treatment in a free trade agreement. So if the origin is not going to be clear, or the origin could still be identified, but in financial services today, it's not clear where the service is produced, who is selling it, what. So trade is going to be a mishmash over time. So it'll not only be where are you working from, where are you producing something will also become an issue of a difficult question to answer, and people will not try to answer it. So even if theoretically it is important, it is not going to be easy to determine these things. Working from home, of course, or working from a different location. For example, there are places where the technological framework or infrastructure to work from home is not very robust. So you can have agglomerations in the same locality. So that's like working from not going to office, let's say. And that will increase, especially as the digitalization becomes more and more. However, the part of goods production and trade will require people to be in the factory where the good is produced before 3D printing becomes much more widely used. So mining will require people. Of course, with technological progress, you require less and less people do a job with efficiency, etc. So, and the other thing is what Trump and his advisors have done is they have sort of reversed the economics of trade and finance and put it on its head. We are back to looking at goods trade balance.
Yeah.
When I was a student, we studied something called absorption of an economy, which results in a balance of payment kind of impact. And goods trade was not really the focus. But when the politics becomes focused on goods trade only, there will be a larger, as it is, services trade is growing very rapidly. And US has a surplus there. So they are not focusing on that because then they can't create a problem to negotiate. They basically want to create a problem for another country so that the country is adversely affected based on that. And then they start negotiation and get something for themselves. So when that starts happening and when immigration becomes an issue, the nature of working from trade could also be seen as a potential problem. Because what has Trump ordered? All the federal employees to come back. So in policy terms, it becomes a political issue that you are not playing fair. By not being in office, you are using resources which are ostensibly not your own resources. Because it could be from any place. And there is oligopolistic behavior which is being forced upon this market, which I am concerned about. And that kind of thought process is now taking root in multiple jurisdictions. The issue of, to me, working from home actually is not such a big issue per se for international trade, investment kind of things. It is what are the policies which are being put on the ground. At one end was China, where the latest manifestation of Chinese policies is in the semiconductor sector, where its firms, especially two firms, have very quickly got 5% of the global market, based on a principle which the government follows, that you go get that market with a low price. I will make sure you don't suffer a loss. So here is an international trade system which we are analyzing using conventional forms of intervention, etc. This is not a conventional form of intervention. When I was looking in 2019 at the electronics sector in China, there was one large investor which started earning profits before it produced a single unit of its product. So you are in a different ball game altogether. And China is so large that its practices, they've already started looking at it, they just don't know how to address it. So to me, these are the key issues which will become the preoccupation of international trade initiatives. Working from home is basically remote working. I mean, you can have remote working in multiple. That's going to go on, especially as digitalization increases, especially as when you look at a supply chain, normally the models of trade have looked at a product produced in country X, sold to country Y, and they don't see the supply. When you look at that, you have to see which parts of the supply chain are likely to fit into your remote working issue. So it can be software, it can be communications, it can be monitoring quality, it can be multiple things. And these are incidentally services which can be digitized, which can, in fact, that's why international trade took off from these initiatives. And those will only increase over time, the remote work or remote monitoring or remote management kind of thing. But some of the key parts, as you pointed out, including management, etc., there has to be a hands-on presence also. You will recall long back there was this smile curve where the manufacturing part, the actual was at the lowest point, the lowest contribution to value addition. When you combine this idea of a global value chain and the fact that this has the lowest part, conventional trade has focused on this lowest part normally. The moment you stick to services, the picture becomes very different. And when you bring in the China effect, that explains in a major way the diagram which you've got where in fact, I'm surprised that the lower wage people didn't lose. Because politically, that was a major factor. Just as the Obama era was coming to an end. That was something where then economic research started finding that China has contributed a lot to the situation becoming worse for workers. So it will be interesting for me.
I can give you more detail on
on that. But I think this is a trend of remote working. More and more production activities will be incorporated into services or into, say, communication, which results in a final production through 3D printing or whatever. And international trade it will not be possible to see international trade through conventional ways of looking at it, precisely because a lot of countries are following the lessons they have got from China. So it's a combination of these, some of them working in the same direction, and some of them creating opportunities where there will be larger gains in some countries than other countries because they will grow faster. The distribution is a different issue. So, I'm sorry, you had raised so many points that I found it difficult to focus on one or two questions. But what I see as a common thread is that there are factors which go beyond this framework, which are going to impact this result. And I am surprised that the curve is like this. I would have expected it to be like this.
Thank you. Shahana, you have the most difficult job, and I'm because now you have coming in from a non-economics perspective, and that makes it actually far more interesting. So please.
Okay, thank you. So this might be the first talk I've been on, which is really on cities and trade, which is kind of surprising because cities have historically played such a enormous role in trade. And one of the first things that I was thinking is that of all the things you talked about, which is trade, migration, and cities, and then there's countries are actually the newest and most the nation state artificial construct. Everything else has existed forever. So in that sense, this entire question of the relevance of cities, because I think that is where you're coming to the city-urban question, right? You didn't have much time to focus, is like, in general, are cities going to be, what role are they going to play with this work from home thing? And then this is across the world and as well as within countries, right? Is this work from home going to equalize it? So what I'll try to do here is maybe just respond a little bit. So I'm not an economist, though I often appreciate the clarity that economics thinking brings, but it also sometimes I struggle with the way one approaches questions because I'm an empiricist. So just a few questions around some of the premises and frameworks, and then maybe I'll talk a little bit about where the urban comes in here, and then maybe finally at the end look at some of the more like development questions or the India-China angle perhaps. So one of the first things is like the animating question was this, when will we reach a stage where people are paid according to their capabilities, so who they are and not where they are? And for me, those are difficult questions to disentangle, because who you are depends a lot on where you are, even if one controls for all kinds of things. And the other part of that is that even if you are all in the same place, who you are isn't really just about your capabilities. So let's look within an organization. We know that there's ample evidence say that there is that women, minorities, people are not paid equally. So in that case, I guess it doesn't necessarily seem to me something that needs to be explained, perhaps, but maybe, but definitely can be explored more in more detail, right? What are these sorts of differences, and to what extent does where you are affect your, and where you're coming from, and where you've grown up affect the wages that you, whether you migrate or whether you stay. And one of the ways I was thinking about it is that, right now you have so many Indian origin CEOs in Silicon Valley, and they are from, very much from the elite here and the elite there. So at one level, you can think that they are the same capabilities, but this may be a case where they've grown up in a place like India, where they are the top of the food chain. And maybe that actually gives them certain advantages when they go to the US versus growing up as a minority or something, right? So that may actually, in a way, benefit them in terms of rising to the top in the US as well, just because of these experiences growing up where they are as who they are in the place they are. So those are some of the points on the larger question. Now, when I was thinking about this, the larger context of globalization, and there's no doubt that it has benefited India and China if you're not thinking so much about the distributional questions. But my question is that the reason that production moved abroad, it really was mostly because of the wage differential. So if I see a place where a situation where the example that you began with, so there's somebody in Mexico who's as good a programmer or coder or someone in India, I would still imagine the main reason that a firm would outsource it would be because the wages are lower. So for me, it's hard to understand why. Just because work is remote, but the main incentive or motivation, and I think that is partly what is driving the remote work as well in the US, is that I don't have to pay them the wages they need to live in a San Francisco or a New York or Washington, DC, so they can work at home. So that's really what technology has enabled, and that's sort of similarly what happened with the globalization of production. So this might be one of the cases where it's not that different. So yes, we will have more remote work and more high-skilled remote work, but it will be because of this difference. And maybe ultimately in the future it will get equalized again, because the wages in another place may go up over time, but then or there might be newer centers. There might not be. It might be less concentrated in big cities. You might have a place like Oregon that comes up. So I don't think it will necessarily fundamentally change the fact that you will have certain concentrations where you have skills and things. And now I'll go back to what role does cities play in that? So I think for a fairly long time we haven't. So I mean, like Ed Glazer has talked about this as well, right? Cities have increasingly, their point is for consumption, not for production. we don't actually need. And we have, especially now, these kind of big cities that we're talking for. And then your colleague at Columbia, Saskia Sassen, has written, it might be interesting to look at her work on this, like cities and globalization, where the idea is, again, that cities have become kind of command and control centers in this new global economy. And that's why they're important, not necessarily because of what they're producing. So there are the different arguments. So the argument for consumption is that, say, there are only a few places where you can have an opera house, or you can have a sports team, and for, like, say, many people in India, why are they, if we can work remotely, why are people living in Delhi where the pollution is so bad? It has schools, it has networks, it has the government here. So there are all sorts of other things which concentrate, which you need, especially, say, at the higher skill levels. So you can move out a whole lot of production, but these are, well, at least I call them superstar cities, right? Certain cities. So maybe what you're having is not so much that these sorts of cities become less important. They may in some way become more important, but some of the old industrial cities have died out, right? And and you may have other cases where you have groups of people. There are also, like, a lot of what happens when workers get fragmented. So in India, we don't have much, and in fact here I do think in general people are required to come in to work. So it's not, and a lot of that has to do with control and monitoring the workforce and things. It's not that flexible, but there's been a lot of research not on this remote workers but on home-based workers. And often what has happened with that is that is very much part of an informal sort of economy where you have, and then you have the platform and digital economy and things. So again, a lot of this, it's based on the fact that you have lower wages and the technology has enabled it. But I don't see it necessarily as an equalizing force. If anything, what it is doing, it's kind of maybe weakening some of the power that labor had when, they were all in a factory together, or say, in wealthier countries where you have some sort of a welfare system and things, to workers here who you can pay a lot less. There are many more of them. So, and they aren't, you don't necessarily have unions but you do have associations and things like that. You probably have, they can't bargain for more wages because you'll go, and you have the whole world of Indian Bangalore workers are asking for too much. You can find someone in, say, another tech city. So I'm not sure how good this will be.
And a couple of minutes?
Yes.
Okay.
So I guess those were my main points. So I think that, and that remote work, so I don't know if it will have, some sort of an impact on cities and, say, on and that may be cyclical. I know that in New York, a lot of the offices they're being converted to houses. So there may be more of this thing where it might become more of a consumption city, and you have a complete hollowing out of the middle class. So that Saskia Sassen has also written about that. So you have a very polarized, you have elites, and you have a very low-end service class. And that, in a way, that's sort of like the picture in a lot of Indian cities as well, because a lot of the production also is kind of moved out of the major cities as well. I guess the only other point I had was, I think India and China are both interesting cases, but they don't actually approximate cases where you have the sort of equal factor prices, because in both cases, so China especially, it had the hukou system, right? So you didn't have free migration, and they also had a strategy where they focused on certain cities and let them grow first, and they invested in them. So I think that will be the case in a lot of developing countries. So the reason that Delhi, for instance, is growing and is so powerful is because, especially in a poor country, it has certain advantages in infrastructure and power and schools and things which you just will not have across the country. So the difference between a Delhi and a rural area is a whole lot more than the difference between, say, even if Paris has a high degree of primacy, between Paris and a rural part of France. The advantages for being in a city possibly are much higher in India and China than it is in another country.
Thank you. May I ask you to respond to the questions and also any other comments that you have on both our discussants' thoughts?
Sure. I spent most of the time in the talk on the trade, and so I have fewer comments on what he had, but I thought that there were some interesting things. One is, so I'll just mention, because I had to go very fast. Can you see here? Yeah. So these are not industries, these are sort of occupations, but you can sort of peg which types of occupations you can think about as different kinds of industries, and also a little bit the tradability. So the big tradable industries are right here, 62 and 67. That's industrial, unskilled and skilled workers. So those are clearly getting crushed, okay? And I would mention like 46 here is actually mid-level sort of supervisors and office workers. 54 is more routine office workers. And so as you're looking through this, you can see the types that are getting crushed. It's also different in the big cities versus the small cities. So it turns out that in the small cities, what's really getting crushed now are 62 and 67, which is the skilled and unskilled industrial workers. Partly that's a historical thing, which is in the big cities, those have already been booted out long ago. So New York, big industrial center, guess when it ended? Well, the 70s and the 80s, that was already disappearing. So that's one of the things. But the other thing is, again, in the big cities, the ones that are getting wiped out, so again, this is mid-level industrial workers. This is sort of modest skill technology workers, essentially the really high-paid things are the high-level managers and the high-level engineers, and there's obviously some movement back and forth between these. But it was just to say that I think that when trying to think about trade in goods, I think that your point about sort of 3D printing and so on is going to change things. Obviously, like in the formerly NAFTA, now U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement. Next, I don't know. We'll see what happens with that. But obviously, they've been dealing with some of these rules of origin things, probably not terribly well, but they've been trying to think about those kinds of issues. The other thing, so I do think mine is really focused on, are there still a lot of tasks that, and one of the issues was, when I think about the consequences within a country or between countries, and the answer is that I'm trying to use what we're learning about what's happening within a country, in this case in the US, to understand how good is it to be working fully remote? Is that something that's really feasible? Because the moment you can actually do it fully remote, then why does it matter whether it's, you go to the Sierra Nevada in California rather than San Francisco because it's cheaper and prettier, rather than, again, there it might be Mexico or somewhere further south if it's in Europe, or possibly some other rich areas of Asia that, coming to India, might be a good place where you can do that. It's really, again, I think that the thing that we understand, that as economists we focus on is opportunities for arbitrage. But you can't just arbitrage according to the category. It depends what the quality is. Because we can't actually hire somebody who's going to get the job done the way that you need to, then that's not going to work. But, and again, I'm not particularly concerned about work from home within India. I think there's an interesting question. But the big thing is, can you arbitrage what's happening in the rich countries? Because that would anchor you up, at least to some extent, towards the wages that they have there. And, will it fully close it? Well, it hasn't fully closed it with the other international forms of integration, but they've converged. And that's the force that I'm wondering, is this going to be a big thing? So let me also say some things about Shahana, and I apologize for taking so much time, but I absolutely agree about the things of where you are to some extent influences who you are. And again, there's a whole other thing. If you're in one place, what are your likelihood of getting a good education? And so everything that I'm saying is about conditional on who you've become. But there's, in terms of native abilities and the things you've achieved, there's another question, which is, are you still the same if you can't be face to face? In some sense, why do we have cities in the first place? So you mentioned the consumption side. I think that's real. I don't think that's actually the dominant force for for agglomeration yet in any Asian countries, North American, et cetera. There's some questions about whether it's a force in Africa. I'll leave that aside. But
I'll just take a couple of minutes more, please, because
okay.
I want to.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let me finish that. So I'm trying to use what's happening within the U.S. cities as a proving ground. Is fully remote feasible? Because the moment it is, they'd really better worry that their job is going to have new, really high quality competition. As if there's a last one. I'll leave it there.
Is there any specific question that you would want a response on, or?
But I guess the only is there will be competition, but it will be driven by wage differences, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we'll tend to close those for that reason.
Can I just
Sure.
on arbitrage? Because you see, arbitrage and whether it succeeds is not a one-period game. So the moment you start arbitraging, like there was arbitrage linked to standards, environmental, labor, etc. And then people started working on some kind of a trade measure. If the arbitrage comes on the basis of cheaper, so labor standards can be used, it all depends on where is the policy mindset going to. And in my view, there is a structural break in that mindset with Trump 2.0. So if you want to analyze it, there was earlier an expected kind of approach that protectionism in different guises. The moment your domestic industry starts,
Harsha, I'm sorry, we will need to.
So that's it. That's something which one needs to look at, because it's not something which is feasible in one period will be allowed the next one.
Thank you. So I'm going to take questions. So we'll do a round of 3 first, and then another round. So Professor Mathur. Yes.
Thank you.
We'll do it in the round.
Thank you, Professor Davis. So when I saw the circular from CSEP about this conference, the thought that immediately came to my mind was that from the time COVID came, I started to work from home. It was close to 60 years. I had been going to office every morning, 9 o'clock, 9:30, and returning in the evening. I started working from home. When I thought over it again, that even within my house, am I mobile? Can I work from anywhere? Or is there a specific place from where I can work more productively? And that really, I sort of looked at this question, at this thought. In the countrywide position, COVID really led to out migration on a big scale. What we do not know is what was the reverse migration from villages to cities or from small cities. We do not know that. What we don't know,
We will need to just a question, please, because there are
the question is that is this a sustainable option? Market-driven, whether it is market-driven and to how long will this go on, or will we revert to the old system of working from not from anywhere, but from a fixed location? Now, in a country where we have very large informal sector, people do work from anywhere they like. We do work from anywhere. And they are productive, they're viable. Now, let us make a distinction between the informal sector employment and the reference that you are making to work from anywhere or work from home. I would make a distinction. And we have a very large informal and urban informal sector.
Thank you.
So this thought.
Karthik?
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for a great discussion on the panel. My question was more to do with the already increasing costs of scaling up operations, whether you're doing it domestically or internationally. Will that actually, in the next 5 to 10 years, give more rise to shifting towards work from home jobs in many sectors, because it allows you to expand operations globally and within a country as well? And will that play a big role in the coming years or not? Thanks.
Any specific panelists that you would want to answer this? Or
No, this is open to the panel.
all right.
Thanks.
First of all, Laveesh, thank you so much for organizing. And Dawn, thank you for the absolutely insightful lecture. I think, as always.
Thanks comes later.
Yeah. No, but I think I can take the opportunity to thank once again. And Harsha and Shahana, thanks a lot. So my question, I think, Dawn, you talked about, most trade theories assume that, winners would compensate the losers. But, in reality, trade adjustment and compensations have not worked as you talked about. That's, and a stylized fact of the data. How do you think, with the new economic integration, which you talked about, a new form of integration, how is this going to work? How should we think about, how should we think about Stolper-Samuelson and winners and losers and, compensation when it didn't work in, standard trade theories? How should we think about it? Thank you.
Thank you. So if you can keep them crisp, then we'll do one more round. I think maybe squeeze in.
So I would say that actually Shahana brought up an idea about working from home when you really can work from anywhere and thinking within a country, which is essentially, imagine the extreme version in which you really, really aren't affected in your productivity at all by where you are. Then you just pick the location that made you most happy. So if Delhi has really smoky days, you don't necessarily have to be there. A lot of people are here because they're tired, they have to get to their job. Delhi is going to be expensive relative to other places. And so it would be an amenity and sort of real consumption city. That would be the only thing left to determine individuals' location. They could work from anywhere. On Karthik, what can I say? I think it's a really interesting observation. I don't know. Cost of scaling up gets high. Will that lead to more work from home? I think that's really going to be location specific. Certainly, there are a lot of places in the U.S. where they're looking at the real estate prices in the central business districts, and they're going, they can work from home, and are doing that. And so they just scale back. They don't entirely disappear, but they scale back. On Prachi, typically in trade theories, we think about winners compensate losers, but they don't actually. How will it be different this time around? And I think that it's actually going to be really hard. And again, there's international justice in some sense, economic justice, and there's distribution within countries. Distribution within countries matters a lot for being able to maintain a policy, and that's why I think that's why we see a lot of the backsliding. But I think this is also something that's going to be much harder to trace if absolutely everything is digital. And so, there may be people who are unhappy about this, but and so you could say, well, within a country, there's going to be a lot of unhappiness in the United States. But if they can't crush it, it may actually lead to a lot of international economic justice.
Any other interventions on the?
No, just one thought on distribution. And Shahana pointed that out. Mankura Olson's work actually shows that whoever is well organized is able to get a lot more of the goodies than the others who are not so well organized. So with the kind of situation which is being conceptualized, organization will become that much more difficult. So, sharing the benefits will become even that much more difficult, I think. The kind of point you just made.
Thank you.
So it won't be better, it'll be worse.
I thought about this feasibility or the advantages of let's imagine a place where amenities and infrastructure and all is equal. But if you decide to go out to Oregon, or lots of people from Delhi have gone to you, and you lose your job, and when we know the jobs are those networks and things, it might make it much harder as long as the firms themselves. And again, this other question is, why would the firms then themselves decide to be in a single location if the workers can be everywhere?
Great, thank you. Dr. Chanda, Amir, and Ben.
Yeah, I think I'll be very brief in making 3 observations. One is, when we say work from home or work from anywhere, in a way we are certifying that immigration doesn't matter and somebody can work while from India. So that's my first observation. My second observation is that there will be hard, as you said, hard to abate, we say, because if there are factories, it will be very difficult. And third point is that we are on a learning curve. It is just 4 years from COVID that we have come out. When I was not knowing that we'll be discussing trade a lot, it reminds me of an economist that we don't generally mention, Kamane Akamatsu, 1930s in Japan, writing that production platforms will shift to the places where comparative advantage is more. So hopefully what is happening is that firms are finding that it is better for the workers to work from home, and workers are adjusting with this. But to give any conclusive judgment in 4 years' time or 5 years' time will be difficult.
Thank you. Amir.
Hello, sir. Thank you for the presentation. I have just 2 major questions. One is whether this form of work is driven by employer or an employee. If it is driven by employer, our experiences with the subletting in informal sector and GVC, the global value chain, has not been very good. If it is employee driven, the low level wage the higher point shows that might also be meaning that these workers might be working multiple jobs to sustain themselves.
Thank you.
That's
Ben.
So I would want to know a holistic picture for the economy when we talk about work from home or work from anywhere. For example, some of the firms might benefit from work from home and work from anywhere, but then at the same time, there are services and other industries that might get adversely impacted. Like I would say, maybe the mobility industry or the real estate. So have you seen that, like the holistic picture of this concept of work from home on the overall economy, taking into account like different sectors and services?
Thanks.
So the first question was whether, in some sense, if we can have work from anywhere, immigration doesn't really matter. And I think that that's actually right, so long as there's not reserved a set of really important tasks that are still not work from anywhere. Again, literally, would be Shahana's solution if everyone would just pick their favorite consumption location, if everybody could work from everywhere. There is a question again, is there a core set of tasks that really have to be done together? My suspicion is yes, especially at the top end. at least over this interval. And there was also the point, we're on a learning curve. I think absolutely. We don't know the answers to these questions yet. We do know that, at least in the US, that it's stabilizing. Work from home is about 28% of all hours. We know, again, from Dingle and Neiman, that they say that 37% of jobs, at least in terms of the tasks, without thinking yet about the teamwork, there's nothing that they actually have to be in a particular location for. The thing that isn't really taking account of is talking to people. And the question is, will Slack and email and the Meta goggles and so on like that, will that actually be an adequate substitute? If it is, even those top ends, the teams will all be digital. And then there was a question, employers versus employees. And I think that there are actually some experiments where they, ask people, do you want to participate in this experiment? Some of them are put into you get to work from home on these days and so on. And the managers definitely had ex-ante expectations. The productivity was going to fall. They, at least in these particular experiments, they didn't find that it fell. And so actually they opened it up to a broader set of people. Employees seem to be willing to trade some wages in order to be able to work from home. There's some suggestion that women particularly might find it helpful because of the inequalities in home care that persist, and so on. And then impact on overall economy. I think, again, there are real gains for those, again, 28% of all hours are being done work from home right now in the US. There are gains from not having to have an hour commute each way. And that may be part of, in some sense, would compensate for other things that may push toward lower productivity. My personal worry, and it's the last thing I'll say on this, is one of the things that comes from being face-to-face is a dynamics of learning and of being brought into the culture. I think that the people who are most sort of enamored of work from home say, yeah, you're talking about people gather around the water cooler and you gather a stray thought and, and suddenly you have $1 billion company. Okay, maybe, but you could instead be having it, rather than this completely random thing, you can actually sort of create your own serendipity. And that maybe that's actually going to be even better than being around the water cooler, because your choice is going to be at the water cooler that you can talk with them. So, Inkits.
Thank you. I have one thought.
Yeah.
Which is, the moment we think in terms of employer and employee, we are overlooking the trend which is there on remote work, self-employed, or, collection of group of small set of people combining their skills and then going ahead with getting business or opportunities. So there are many who opt for that kind of job. And it's more likely than not that the proportion of remote working will be larger for those kind of jobs. So it's employer-employee is the factory kind of version.
Shahana.
I just had a bit of an empirical question about what does work from home really mean work from anywhere, or is it more that it's not going? Because I can understand that saving your commute, but there's so many other sorts of things. I would imagine that it's a very rare person that actually moves to the Nevada mountains. I'm just thinking of my very global, lots of work from home. At most is perhaps to save, New York rents. They might move, but they might have moved for that even before, and now they're saving on the commute. So what extent is it just, not having to be in your office, or is it like you actually can be anywhere in the world?
So I'll try and answer this really quickly. So something you can see in the data in the US and some other countries is what's called the donut effect, which is that people who have to go in 5 days a week to the central business district need to be pretty close in. Once they only need to go in 1 or 2 days a week, they move further out. And that's actually where the prices are going up and they're going down sort of in the center of the donut. And, also, so the donut effect tells me that people are adjusting location. I agree with you, not a lot are going to really remote things. But again, once you get to the moment where you can do your job 5 days a week without ever coming or rarely coming into the office, how secure is that job to international offshoring of it? Because basically it's all digital anyway. Why does it matter? And it's that moment at which the competition, because the wage differences are enormous. If productivity doesn't matter, that you're, again, 60 miles and never come in, or 2,000 miles.
Thank you. Okay. I'm so sorry. We'll have to take this offline. We are about video. So thanks a lot. I mean, it is absolutely, there is no doubt that work from home, work from anywhere, or work from coffee shop, which is where I do most of my work. It's not just a trend. It is definitely going to happen. We are living in a world where fighter jets are now operated remotely. We are talking about AI-driven drones, which are operating farms. We are talking about robots controlled remotely by surgeons. So that's only a matter of time. And we've already heard from both of our discussants on what's going to happen to manufacturing, what's going to happen to cities and countries, or what could potentially happen to cities and countries. So these boundaries that we have grown up with are actually going to end. It may not happen in the next 3 years or 5 years, it may take 10 or 20 years, we don't know. And that's obviously going to create a completely different way of working. And it's been amazing to have such an amazing panel here with us. I'm very glad that you asked us. And I'm very glad that you could be here. And I'm so glad that Shahana, yourself, and Harsh, that you could make it here. Believe you me, we will be back hopefully with the same panel again. And hopefully you will be in India again very soon.
But apparently I don't need to be.
Okay. On that note, thank you and your audience.
Thank you so much.